What's up, everybody? I had a request to do some drum processing, so I'm gonna try to make this quick. I just recorded one and it was like 20 minutes, so I feel like it was way too long. So I'm gonna try to do this relatively quickly, but show you how I processed my individual channels as well as my drum bus for my album, The Revenant. What I often do is once I feel like I have a pretty good sound as far as the kick and the snare and all that, I tend to use I end up using the same samples on almost every track and and process it the same way, and I find that gives me a pretty consistent sound. So especially when I'm making a concept album where tracks are mixing in together from one to the other, you need to have, or at least I need to have, like a pretty standard sound that I know is going to fit together. So, and in the in between, right now, obviously, I don't really have an album plan, so I'm just messing around. This is the time when I practice and learn new tricks and maybe get new plugins and all of that. And so, the way that I process drums is probably going to be changing in the future, but this is just some tips of how I currently process drums. So let's go by individually on each track, and then I'll show you the drum bus. So for the kick, if I was to turn all the effects off, the kick start off like this. Now you may notice there's a bit of a difference in volume. One thing that I do is on the kick that plays with the snare, and like outrun, I feel like you want that kind of more EDM, I guess, for the floor, kick snare, but like with the kick. But if you have a really punchy kick and you have a really punchy snare, you're going to end up with some serious transients and some serious peaks to deal with. So what I do is I will turn the, what the heck is this called, velocity down. And that way, so I'll essentially reduce the volume. You still get some of that bottom end of the kick, and you still get the thump of the kick, but you're not going to have, you still have some peaks to deal with, but it's not as crazy. I mean, there's times when I would be, have my limiter on when I was mastering and playing, and the kick and snare would play, everything would be fine, the kick and snare would play, and it would jump to like, 4 dB, 5 dB gain reduction. So I figured this kind of helps with that. So dry or just on its own, the kick sounds like this. With everything, it sounds like this. So it's a little less boxy, I feel like, a little bit more snappy. If you notice, there's not a ton of low end. Mostly lives in this like 60 to 100 area. And so what I found myself doing is I'll have my kick kind of take up this space between 60 and say 100, and then my sub bass lives between 60 and 30 really. So I try to get some separation between the kick and the bass by doing that. I also try to tune my kicks to the perfect fifth, which again, I'm terrible at music theory, but there's a really good tutorial that I can link to that talks about kind of tuning your kicks so that you don't really have frequency masking, you don't have that mud. So I cut some of the low end. Again, if I'm having the low end of my kick live up here, I'll cut, especially my headphones can barely pick up frequencies down this region. 99% of people that are being listening to my music are not going to be having a system that's going to be anywhere below 30, 20 hertz. So you're just eating up headroom. So I will cut that on my kick. And I hate the kind of like boxy snares and boxy kicks. So I'll often, and this is a kind of fine line, because if you cut too much, now you end up with this kind of like hollow, lifeless sound. But if you leave too much or don't cut, then you end up with that kind of boxy sound. So I cut around 200, pretty substantial cut, around 5 dB. And I also cut around 2 kilohertz, and that was just, I felt, again, sometimes you get a little mush, and it also opens up space for other parts of the song, maybe a bit more of the snare. But I do like a nice click, with the transient coming through and cutting through the mix, so I added 2 dB at 6 kilohertz. For the compressor, Um, yeah, one thing that I started doing is you can, bring the ratio all the way down, bring the threshold all the way down, and start playing your kick. And we'll do it actually right now. So you bring all this down, you bring your attack to 0, and now you've essentially taken away the entire sample. But what you can start doing is moving this attack, and once you get a little bit of that transient cutting through, you can kind of set your attack. Right around here is good, and then you can dial it back. So we'll go to 4, and you want to leave it at that. So that's a way if you're having difficulty figuring out attack and release and all that stuff. That is, it doesn't work for everything. Like obviously, like a pad or some kind of like longer lead is going to be difficult. But you're like a punchy, maybe a percussion, a kick, snare, something like that. That's the way you can start to kind of shape the transients. I got this actually a couple weeks ago. This is awesome soft tube tape. I've played around with a bunch of different tape saturation plugins. This is my favorite because it's one of those plugins like you don't notice it that much, but when it's gone, you notice that's not there. And that's what I really like. Some of the other tape saturation plugins I've tried have been really not so subtle, and can get kind of really harsh in the upper frequencies. So without it, it sounds like this, and with it, again, it's just a little bit. If you put the setting on B, if you do have this setting for B is very good for kind of low end kick bass. It brings a little bit of a boost in the low end. I brought the tape speed down to 7.5, just to give it a little more oomph in the low end. Now this is a free EQ. If you don't have it, definitely pick it up. It's essentially if you know like waves like VEQ 3 and 4. This is essentially waves VEQ 3. So you have 3 different bands that you can adjust. So again, in that kind of 300, really like 200 to 500, and maybe a little 600, you get that kind of boxy area, some of that mud. So I cut a lot. I cut 4 dB. You can boost about 2.5, and that kind of adds that click and give it a little bit of top end, just a little bit, around 10 kilohertz. So without it, so I really like what that does and kind of gives it a bit more like snap. So that's it for the kick. I'm moving a little more quickly. We have the snare without processing, sounds like this. With. One thing that I found is the Redux is essentially Bit Crusher in Ableton, but it, messing around, I was having difficulty finding a snare that I really liked, and they all seemed kind of like flat, didn't really feel that full, and this was I found kind of by accident. This is the original, and I add this on. It really changes the sound of the sample itself, and so, that was something that now I often will, I don't always use Bit Crusher or Redux on my snares, but after seeing like how much it can change the sound, I'll definitely at least cycle through and see what it does. Because it plays the same time as the kick, I'll cut the low end, and you'll see I have a bunch of EQs. I tend to use different EQs for different things. So like this EQ is just kind of like cutting the highs and the lows. This EQ is more getting some surgical cuts. So cutting around 140, kind of again more mud area, 467, and boosting up around 4 kilohertz. I feel like that's, if we take a look, we have kind of this peak area. So we have, again, this is where the snare is living, but at least the low end of the snare, but I'm playing the kick at the same time, so the kick's kind of taking up the duties of this. And so we have this kind of brings up the high end. Again, the slick EQ and cutting and kind of the mud areas, giving a little bit of boost, a little more snap, and giving it some air in the high end. This is a free rack from Afro DJ Mac. If you have Ableton and you don't know who this guy is, go check out Afro DJ Mac. He's got some awesome free stuff as well as stuff for sale. It's essentially just, well, it's not essentially, it is a gated reverb. And so if you're familiar with racks, you can do parallel process, so you don't have to even send anything to a bus. You can have one dry channel, one wet channel. So if you look, the reverb is at 100, but you essentially use this as a dry wet. So you control the volume of this channel, but you have completely dry, and completely wet, combine them together, and there you go. So this is just a pretty simple rack with macros to get some gated reverb. I compressed it a little bit, compressed the snare, but also compressing some of the reverb to kind of make it stand out more. And I did feel that without this, I felt like adding a little bit of reverb gives a bit more space, even though it's kind of weird to gate your reverb and then add more reverb after. I felt like a little bit of reverb at the end gave it a bit more space. And then again, just double down and cut the lows, cut some of the highs so it's not too harsh. As far as my clap, this is a standard clap I use. This clap is 707 clap. You can find it in that giant pack floating the internet with like a billion drum samples, or even if you have Ableton, they have a 707 rack. And it's just a little bit of reverb. So the clap on its own, if I could play it, that'd be awesome. So it's got a nice long tail, so it really sticks out. I didn't use a hi-hat in this one. I used the ride cymbal as essentially as a hi-hat, like an open hi-hat. But not a ton of processing. Just I really can't stand cymbals and hi-hats that have a ton of low end, and they're not have this part cut out. So you have to be careful because sometimes they get a little too tinny and harsh. But what you can also do is, I'll do this sometimes, if you have a sample with too much of a transient, and especially when it's like if you're playing 16ths or 1/8 and you're playing over other samples like the kick, you can fade in a little bit, so there's less of a transient, and you have less of an issue of some like peaks. So the ride was used more as a kind of hi-hat cymbal. So and again, just a 707. I did add this velocity. This is a great tool if you use Ableton to kind of humanize your I use this a lot on drums and cymbals, so you don't get that like that just that machine gun. And you can go in and you can adjust the velocity, but if sometimes you want to get lazy, you can just put a little bit of randomness, and it'll kind of vary the velocity slightly, so you don't have that kind of robotic feel. Cut a pretty decent amount of the low end, added some reverb to give it a little space, and felt that it was pretty harsh in the high end, so I just brought that down. And lastly but not leastly, well, at least for the individual channels, the toms, these are just Simmons and these SDS5 tom sample. And I'm parallel processing there's a reverb and ping pong delay, so they're both kind of feeding into each. Cut the low end, cut a little bit in the mids, boosted a little bit of the highs to make it kind of stand out in the mix, and compressed it a little bit. So as far as the bus processing goes, I have an EQ cutting some of the lows and a little bit in the 200 hertz. Again, just cut some of that mud. Once you start adding all these effects, things start building up. I often will cut something effect a certain way and then cut that same again. Little boost in the high end, trying to make the snare kind of stick out a bit more. You'll see we did the same thing over here. But I used a capitator. This is awesome. You have to be careful because you can definitely overdo it. So you can see it's subtle, a little bit of drive. But I use the E setting. Now the E setting, you have to be careful because it can make your stuff really harsh, and you can add it a lot in the upper frequencies. T is actually, the setting is really good for drums, and you can use for drums. I often use that for bass. But yeah, for whatever reason, I think I started with the drum Fender preset and tweaked from there, so set it to E. Cut more, cut a little bit in, 75 hertz. Cut some of the this is kind of where the bass for the kick is residing. Cut around 300 and boosted a little bit around 1.6 kilohertz. Bring out that snare a little bit more. Added some saturation. If you don't have this, this is free. This is fantastic. It's super simple. Put it on, turn the knob. That's it. It sounds really good because without it, it sounds like this. I'll do that so you don't have to hear the toms. And then with it, and then I have here the drum bus. This is something that comes with Ableton. This thing is awesome. Even if you put it on and put everything to 0, you're still going to hear a difference. So you do have to be careful because you can definitely overdo it. But add a little bit of drive. You can either add some transients and kind of like make things kind of, I guess, more sharp. Add some more attack, or you can take away some attack and tame some of the transients. So I just turn this up a little bit. And this is awesome. You have this boom knob, and so what this is you figure out the frequency of the sub. If you look at the root of your kick, so this kick is in D, so you can find the frequency for the root. So if I was to move this, right, it'll get you around the air. So if I want to go to D, I'll get to D. If I click on this, it'll push me directly, exactly on the frequency for D, and then I can turn this up. So this works kind of like Waves has R bass, or I think it's like BX subfilter. And it's going to, I believe on this, I know in subfilter it's like a resonant cut, so it's like a low cut with a high resonant filter, or high resonance. I believe this is doing the same thing. Don't quote me on that. But all I do know is it adds a bit of boom, hence the dial. Now, one thing, if you notice, this is dry wet's at 13%. This is a very powerful effect. So if I turn this all the way up, all right, you can very easily overdo it. So it's a little parallel processing. And then lastly, but not leastly, just the SSL comp. And you can use any compressor. Ableton has the glue compressor, which is pretty much the same exact thing. People say they hear a difference. I have no idea. My ears are not that great for hearing that stuff. But tame those peaks and kind of glue everything together. I think I had a higher attack. Usually I'll have around like, I have the attack over here, around 10. Let's see, let's do this. I think I had to tame some of the peaks because I was having some issues. So yeah, that is it. I'm sure there's things that I'm doing incorrect. I'm sure there are much better ways of doing, different things that I'm trying to do. But that is just the way that I processed all my drums in my album, The Revenant. And like I said, now is the time when I'm not necessarily making an album. Do a little experimenting, learn some new things, and probably look back and realize that everything I was doing was wrong. So if you have any questions, leave a comment. If you want to see any other videos, leave a comment. But yeah, I hope this was helpful, and yeah, see you later.